Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tales of Scale, part of our 2020 Symposium series. My name is Bob Bolson. I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture with Imagine Communications. I'm joined today by John Myatt, CTO of Networking and Infrastructure, Gareth Wills, Product Manager for Automation, and Darby Marriott, Product Manager for Playout. Hello, John, Gareth, and Darby. It's nice to have the opportunity to chat with all of you. Along with the rest of the Solutions Architecture team, I spend a great deal of my time talking with customers, and one of the common themes that comes out of these conversations is that all of them are looking for ways to expand their presence in one way or another. That may mean adding more channels, adding custom variations of current channels, or simply adding an OTT version of an existing channel or channels. Now, for some customers, that means moving from 3 channels to 5 channels, and for some, it means moving from 50 to 100. Adding another variable to all of this is the ongoing transition in the industry from traditional baseband architecture to IP, whether it's compressed or 2110. I think Imagine is really uniquely positioned to handle all of these challenges using our modular playout solutions and software-defined network orchestration, SDNO, with processing tools acting as the Swiss Army knives between all of it. John, talk a little bit about how the implementation of COT switches and SDNO helps build a proper foundation for broadcasters to scale their operations.
Sure, Bob. I think it's been interesting to watch the evolution of these playout centers over the last few years because, it's always been hard to do things that had more than a few channels. But as all these variants, OTT variants and .2 and .3 channels and so forth have come out over the years, it's really put pressure on the scalability of playout architecture, and that rippled back into traditional SDI routing. A facility with a router that had maybe 256 or 512 output ports, there'd be meetings and arguments over what things am I going to take out of the router so I can add one more playout thread. And that has become a limiting factor in the design and the architecture of facilities, is how do we deal with the fact that SDI routers are really just fundamentally limited in size. And that's not even talking about UHD or any of the new requirements. So the move to IP for playout environments is driven by this scalability, and the IP infrastructures have just incredible scale. I mean, even if you're talking about a simple 1RU switch with a couple 32 or 3600 gig ports, that's 1,000 by 1,000 3 gig SDIs. That's just a huge router in a 1RU package. And by the way, that's the smallest one they make. So the IP infrastructure scales to, really incredible sizes. It's nice for once that the television industry is not the leading edge of technology of a use case like that. The fin trading people use switches 10 times that size. So we're in a really good place technology-wise to build fully scaled out systems. It's a whole different matter. So the connectivity technology is not the limiting factor anymore. Now it's really up to manageability and all the other attributes of the playout system.
Interesting. So in terms of the architectural challenges of scaling that I mentioned at the outset, let's tackle things one at a time, I guess. So first, let's talk about simply adding new channels. Darby, typically when people want to spin up new channels, we don't have the luxury of months or even weeks worth of notice anymore, do we?
No, that's absolutely right, Bob. I think when we look at deploying those channels, it really is a benefit to have something that is based on a strong software architecture, and that really allows you the flexibility of saying, all right, even if it's a small type of deployment where for an example, we have 3 channels that are on air and they simply want to immediately stand up a 4th channel. Using something that has a very firm template-based approach allows us to quickly replicate one of those existing channels into, in this case, a 4th channel. So taking that blueprint and essentially replicating that into another channel instance allows us to very quickly spin that up.
I think it goes without saying that moving from 3 to 4 is going to be easier than moving from 50 to 70 or something like that, right?
Yeah, and traditionally that's been kind of the difficulty is, okay, it's not so bad to do 1 extra channel, but when it comes to doubling the number of channels within a very large scale operation, which we've also seen, based upon necessity for taking on these new contracts, or basically just combining efforts with other partners to make a very large ecosystem in a playout architecture. Taking that to scale is really, again, something that we as an industry have been challenged with, and taking a look at how we can go and leverage some of the new tools from a deployment standpoint. And again, taking that same model we talked about with the small channels, with a blueprint approach that is basically this, the organic nature of the specific channel, but then having tools to automate the process to deploy these out en masse. And it may not just be one persona that we're deploying out; it may be different ones. We want to make sure that we can, again, put in the right specific attributes that are going to be representative of those channels, but again, do it in a fashion that doesn't take the weeks and months that it may in a very large ecosystem, but now do something in a matter of days, because we've got these tools that can now efficiently and systematically deploy on a large scale.
Yeah, it's not always about adding channels, though, is it?
Yeah, it's adding channels is certainly a piece of it, but the other side of that coin is kind of the scaling out as opposed to scaling up. And by that, I mean, maybe it's OTT variants of existing channels, or even another version of a channel that's delivered the same way as the main channel, but with either regionalized ads or alternate graphical looks. So Gareth, when you spin up an OTT version of a primary channel, that sounds simple, but there are challenges, right?
Yeah, so we're finding most large broadcasters want to do OTT in some form, and it's scaling horizontally. So you're taking your existing feed and maybe you're bolting on new capability to do some downstream ad insertion. I think that the market has generally embraced technologies such as SCUDdy 104 and 35 in order to achieve this functionality. And historically, we've found that these protocols work great for your 1 minute commercial at the top of every hour, typically on a network feed. But for more dynamic type workflows, we find that we need some sort of hook into automation just to get that information. So forward-looking APIs in order to scrape that data, so the ad decision engine can work ahead of itself and get the inventory in real time. So, and there's also, you've got to consider rights. So you might have the rights to play a piece of content on linear, but not on digital. So you have to consider how to cover that material. And obviously there are specifications within the protocols in order to signal the blocking of that material. But some customers have expressed concern that they're sending a program down the wire, and they're hoping that the downstream device is going to do the right thing. And if it doesn't do the right thing, it's going to cost them a lot of money. So there's a lot of trust there in terms of protection of content and digital rights management, things like that. So a few customers we've worked with have actually created sub channels, which are they have sub switching commands within their primary channel in order to drive some of these OTTs, so they can really programmatically decide actually what goes out on these OTT channels. But just as a general rule, OTT and SCUDdy workflows are becoming more of the norm in terms of what we're seeing from projects. Just running a simple OTT ad insertion channel to right down to sort of adding commercials at the set-top box level. So it's become expected, and it's the new normal in terms of planning.
That is interesting about the rights, Gareth. So with the regionalized advertising, how do we make that easier for broadcasters?
So, there's SCUDdy, which is designed primarily for downstream insertion, which I've talked about. When you start to add regions and sort of +1 channels, we're now talking more about scaling vertically. And this is where we want to get a little bit smarter with workflows. You often maybe require some different branding and substituting more content for these types of channels. But when we start to talk about regional variant playlists, they're basically a subset of the master channel. So here concepts such as linked list come into play, and also master follow. So basically we're deriving a playlist from another playlist. Internally we've been experimenting with these concepts for a long time, and the trick is to make these lists transparent to operators, populating changes across multiple lists while still allowing unique opt-in regional content. So, as Darby mentioned earlier, the holy grail of this is obviously to be able to scale up these variants quickly using, modern deployment technologies and that sort of thing, and to create a channel within hours. but also the ability, there's a critical ability to be able to link these channels so that you can link a master and a variant and really allow customers to monetize content across multiple screens.
So Gareth, that's all well and good for, you know, the tried and true approach of building up channels, but, you know, if we haven't learned anything in these last few months, it's that, you may not be able to get to your own physical plant. You know, how can we help, address that, and what have we seen from some of the lessons we've learned?
DR, so the insurance policy, you hope you never have to draw on. I do think, the last few months has taught us a lot around, the current DR models, right? But previously it was all about protecting your brick and mortar, and now, we've got perfectly good buildings and perfectly good facilities, but you just can't get staff in the building in order to drive it. So, longer term, I think the last few months and then the COVID-19 situation is potentially going to drive more data center channels, especially for things like DR. So, obviously the utopia would be an operator being able to drive a channel from their lounge. And I think the technology is probably there with some creativity, but I think, it's more of a cultural and a business challenge to allow that sort of operational models at the moment. So, and also, scaling up, as you mentioned earlier, is really easy in the cloud, because you don't have to rack any hardware, and there's automated tools that can get us close to that holy grail that I think we all want to be able to do, and that is spinning up channels at a touch of a button. And also on the topic of DR, we had an interesting project recently where we split the main and redundant playback between two sites. In a more traditional model, you have a one-to-one backup on a single site. This solution had one location which had the main, and then the other location contained the backup, and a decent sort of data pipe between the two of them. To be honest, I thought the idea was a little bit crazy at first, but when I look back on it, it was genius, because you get playout resilience, you get geodiversity, so the best of both worlds, and really for the same price as what you would have budgeted for a one-to-one backup. So that it was a very creative solution to sort of a real world problem. Anytime you start to expand your facility outside of the normal operating envelope, obviously schedule synchronization becomes critical. Especially if you want to keep real-time synchronization between the two sites. And I know, John, you were involved with the same sort of projects. So maybe you can share some experience on how routing and infrastructure can work between sites.
Sure. I mean, it's a big topic, because on the routing and infrastructure side that holds these sites together, you also need that kind of survivability, that if the A site is up and the B site has some horrific problem, that the A site needs to be able to operate completely and fully autonomously and correctly. And the same is true of the B site. So, on the good days, when both sites are up and everything's golden, there's a lot of sensitivity to the operations team about the latency between the sites, because they might be managing channels that are really rolling in the building they're not in. And so there's been a ton of work in the industry the last few years to develop new codecs. In particular, JPEG XS is the new favorite for how do you get very low latency video between facilities at production quality while still managing the latency. So the XS codec has a latency inherent to the codec of only a couple of lines. It's really a brilliant solution. The latency between the buildings becomes the physics latency of the packets. Now, of course, if you have a special relationship with the carrier in your area, maybe you just have a ton of fiber and you can do it at uncompressed. That's always, no one complains about the picture quality of uncompressed if they can afford it. But JPEG XS is a great next step down the curve in terms of, save some bandwidth, but still get extraordinary picture quality. And all these solutions require a certain amount of engineering of all the different failure modes. How is timing related between the facilities? How is redundancy related? And how is survivability rated, so that the facilities are truly survivable of each other 100%. But all these problems are very solvable. The technology is there. It's really about the operations workflow and the people workflow. And how do you make the staff be trained naturally to accommodate whatever life throws at them on a given day?
It is amazing how many of the challenges are training challenges versus science problems anymore, John. That's a great. Darby, earlier Gareth talked about regionalized ads within the same primary video content, but on top of that, you may also have to have a different graphical element on top of the same video content. Traditionally, that's required an additional channel, right?
Yeah, I think that's another problem to solve, which is, we need to prepare our graphics for this additional channel. And oftentimes, that channel really isn't that vastly different from the main channel. We just want to be able to differentiate it with, maybe a different logo bug, or maybe it is getting different promotions that are being played on that channel. Whereas, yes, traditionally, we would have had to go and prepare a whole separate set of graphics, have a separate playlist that is responsible for triggering those graphics. So it becomes quite involved from both the traffic department for scheduling as well as the graphics department for managing those additional assets. Now, with the new tools that we have at our disposal, we're looking at means by which we can go and unify on not only the graphics creation with different creation tools like After Effects, but then the way that we actually propagate them into those playback channels means that I don't have to take the additional, all the different parameters into account. I essentially are just looking at a singular asset that is then marked for playback from one channel or another, just depending on the nature of that specific playout channel. So it really becomes a more simplified process. And again, as we talk about, how we can go and, not make sea changes to any operational workflows. For this, it really becomes, we can be more efficient, require less operators, less graphics creation artists. So overall, just makes an easier to use system to scale up.
Excellent. So we've talked a lot about scaling infrastructure and architecture, but it still leaves some operational complexities to solve. Everyone is doing more with less. So adding new channels or new channel variants doesn't really gain a broadcaster anything if those channels can't be managed with the team they already have in place. So Gareth, how do we handle all these new channels in a breaking news scenario or live sports scenarios that typically are very dynamic?
So you're right, Bob. When live sports and breaking news are probably the most challenging aspects of operations when you scale up. Obviously, more channels means more stress, but typically it's the same number of operators who have to drive those channels. Operations is typically the biggest expense in a facility. So we talk about this magic operator to channel ratio, which you often hear talked about, and it's what sort of tools can we provide in order to make the economics around that more efficient. And of course, it's different for each customer depending on the workflow that they need to support and the reactivity of their channels. So we look at technology to help. So things like linking breaks between channels through a common GUID. So when you move a break on the master list, it moves on the follow lists. And then doubling this up into sort of user-friendly UIs. I'll give you an example. When I was an operator, I used to be terrified of doing tennis, and that was it. That was on a single channel, right? And so if you extrapolate that out with the tools that we've been able to develop through HTML UIs and some of the back-end API changes we've done, we've got customers out there who are controlling 7 channels of live tennis with a single operator. So we've been able to gain efficiencies through the use of that sort of technology and just different ways of thinking around how we control those channels. Obviously things get further complicated when you add multiple time zones. So the president wants to do a press conference. You have to break into multiple channels. Every channel might be running its own content. So it's our job to make sure that they don't have to do a lot of that complicated math in order to do the breakaway and sort of calculate what they need to do to resume. So it's simple tools like I was mentioning, a touch of a button, break into a program, and then break out across multiple channels and just make the tasks easier for operators. So when it goes right, they get some feedback, and even when it goes wrong, they get feedback, and it's all wrapping it up into an intuitive UI.
When we started demoing those HTML5 master control UIs for customers a couple of years ago now, they were always met with a lot of excitement and a lot of smiles and head nodding. And then after about 10 seconds, inevitably the questions would start, I want to turn off this button. I don't want my operators to have access to that. I would like to move this up here so it doesn't get hit accidentally. I don't want them to be able to trigger graphics. On and on. And you know, we kind of realized pretty quickly that that wasn't something that we were going to be able to do on a case-by-case basis, was it?
Yeah, a little too quickly, to be honest with you. Master control is high touch, right? It's the face of our product. You know, and every customer has slightly different requirements, and every customer wants to do things, you know, slightly differently from an operational point of view. You know, what we found, as you said, was some customers wanted pre-take, some customers wanted take. You know, and so the UI kind of, let's just say it evolved. You know, and to a certain extent, our development team was also challenged, because they'd come to me and they'd say, well, where do you want me to put this new button? And so UX would have to figure it out, and eventually it kind of got to a point where we started to look at some new ways of UX and how we expose the capability to operators. You know, and a fixed UI is really not scalable. So, you know, we took a step back, we looked at our master control capability, and we started to split it into widgets. And we introduced a flexible framework, and that allows you to mix and match capabilities. So, you know, being widgets, you still get the same sort of look and feel and the user experience that we want you to have. But, you know, if you don't need it, you don't need to add it, and you don't need that additional real estate being taken up. So you can really optimize that user experience better, and allow better flexibility for the customers, but it also helps our development cycle and means we can deliver smaller functional modules a lot quicker.
Yeah, it's really the best of both worlds, Gareth. Now, with some of our largest customers, we've actually implemented a concept of channel recipes, as we call them, to help ease the burden of deployment, haven't we, Darby?
Yeah, that's right, Bob. I think what we've found is that, you know, with software, it can be infinitely configurable, and that's obviously a good thing, but it is a challenge that we need to kind of put some bounds around. So when we look at the myriad options that we have, I mean, you look at, you know, all the different options we have, from audio, from Dolby to upmix, downmix, loudness correction. You've got captioning. You've got, you know, Nielsen requirements in the U.S., EAS in the U.S. You know, compounding with the different formats, flavors of SDI and 2110 and transport stream. You know, it becomes a little daunting, perhaps, at some regards, to how to configure a system. So what we found is, you know, being able to go and group some of these like-for-like functions that make it, you know, more of a palatable, this is a solution. We can go and take this and quickly deploy it without making a ton of changes to it. But at the end day, we still have, again, the flexibility under the hood. We can still add on those options and make it customized to, you know, suit the needs of the individual opportunity. So, you know, looking at a small system that, again, might need, you know, just a single live input and one branded output. You can run that, you know, with a multi-channel configuration, so you can get the benefit of density within a given hardware platform. And then taking a look at more advanced channels that maybe need more graphics requirements, more inputs. You've got multiple DVEs for doing squeeze backs and reveals. And those then obviously constitute additional you know, hardware resources to supply that functionality. So we'll kind of group that within the bounds of a next tier or recipe that allows you to gain that functionality without, again, you know, grouping all these individual components together. So for us, it's really kind of keeping that hybrid approach of, yes, flexible with software, but also something that people can understand. This is going to work off the shelf with this configuration and get a good experience out of it.
And just to add to that, you know, back to my point around regionalization and channel variants, obviously, Darby, you know, sometimes the follow channel, the regional variant, doesn't necessarily have to have all the bells and whistles, as you said, of the master channel. And, you know, there's been a couple of projects where we've really been able to leverage the ability to be able to scale up and scale down the capability of the channel through these channel recipes, and really be able to optimize the cost for our customers. And generally, it's worked really well.
That's great, guys. Thanks. So we've talked a lot about channel expansion, both kind of in the vertical sense, in terms of adding additional channels, and also in the horizontal sense, in terms of content diversification, whether that's adding regionalized ads to an existing channel or adding unique graphical content to an existing channel. Obviously, as these channel counts grow, it's inevitable that you're going to go through some growing pains where you end up with a mix of new IP-ready equipment and legacy SDI equipment.
It's not really fair to call it a growing pain. It's just a growing reality that the world is full of equipment that has been produced for many years that's SDI based. And I've never met a broadcast engineer that would willingly part with a functional piece of equipment, no matter how old it is, if it had an ounce of life left in it. So the SDI legacy will be with us for many, many years. And yes, we wind up integrating those SDI workflow pieces, perfectly good, valid, many of them not that old, into IP domain projects. And that's just the life of the project. So our focus has really been on how do we provide those gateway solutions in a way that's straightforward and scalable and no muss, no fuss, but in a hardware platform that can then do other things later. Because I think everybody realizes that while I might need a gateway for that 5-year-old server just now, hopefully it's going to be retired 2 years from now when I do the refresh of that part of the room. So that gateway, I don't want it to be a throwaway. I want it to be a ongoing, platform I can do other things with. And that's really what we've focused on in our processing line is gateway today, but processing, multi-viewers, other functionality just by feature upgrades. And that's in fact what our SMP does, is that every different, it's always the same hardware, and you just key it up for whatever function you want that day. So we've seen already projects where people start out using a bunch of gateways, then the next year they update the servers or they update some other piece, they free up a bunch of those gateways, flip them into multi-viewers or flip them into HDR converters or flip them into UHD converters. It's really just part of the course. It's part of the new course of business, is how do we embrace and integrate all of the SDI and legacy equipment into the new system and into the current, into a combined workflow that meets the needs. And no workflow is ever a one and done. Every project worth doing has evolution that's planned over years. And you see that in the software architecture and you see that in the hardware architecture. So all said, it's a great way to build a system, and you can't assume you'll have a green field. Nobody gets that luxury, really. You always have something you want to bring forward from the old place. And we just embrace that and roll it into the project every time.
Well, guys, this has been very interesting. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks to everybody out there who took the time to listen.